All right, well, I see our faces in OBS. That's always a good sign. And it is afternoon for both of us, so I can say good afternoon, Glenn. How are you?
I'm doing great, Nate. How are you?
I'm cold. I'm not gonna lie. It's very cold here in Minnesota today. Much colder than you, although you have a very nice sweater on. I probably should be wearing your sweater, quite frankly. But
I need it.
I shudder to even look at what the current temperature is. But I will. It's -4 right now, so it's actually
Wow.
13 degrees warmer than it was when I left the house this morning to get a haircut.
It is
So
here in Plano, Texas. It is 50 degrees warmer than that. It's
I'm jealous of you,
46,
man. I'd much
46
rather have that.
degrees.
It's all relative though. It'll be about 40 degrees warmer here tomorrow. Just unfortunately, that means it'll still be below freezing. But what are you gonna do? Other than leave, I guess I could leave. Multiple
It's
people have
been
told me
done.
I'm not. It has been done. I mean, our friend Mike Nygaard actually
Yes,
managed to
that's
to
right.
escape the orbit of Minnesota. So it's possible. It's possible. Anyway, well, so Glenn, I'm so delighted to get to hang out with you here today. Thank you for joining me. It is a pleasure as always. I don't get to see you as often as I like,
No,
especially in the pandemic era, but what are we
right.
gonna do? What are we gonna do? So for people who are unfamiliar with your illustrious background, what how did you get into this strange world of computers? What drew you into this line of work? How did Glenn end up where Glenn is today?
Well, I've often wondered what on earth I would have done if I had been born 50 years earlier before
Hmm.
computers
Mm-hmm.
were around. Um, I I discovered computers in at the beginning of 10th grade, um, which seems late to a lot of people these days, but you know I'm old enough that that meant uh, I started going to the high school where they had a teletype machine in the physics classroom, um, with a a paper tape punch and reader, and
Mm-hmm.
a modem with acoustic couplers where you dial the telephone to the time sharing system, and heard the whistles and slammed the phone down in there. And um, so I learned basic there, and uh, had a kind of long and winding road toward a computer science degree in college. But in the process, got a lot of interesting work experience, and then have been a programmer ever since, starting in the late 80s. Um, and I've spent about half of my career in consulting
Mm-hmm.
roles of some form or another, and um, the other half in product development roles at companies, or more recently in management and leadership roles.
What do you think is, speaking of the management and leadership, what do you think is the biggest sort of misconception folks in our line of work who come from a more technical background then get into more of a managerial role to have about being a manager, or maybe another way of phrasing that is there any advice that you would have for a newly minted technical manager? Because I do think technical management is a really tough job, quite frankly.
It is, and when I tried it for the first time about 9 years ago, um, or 8 years ago, VP of engineering, where I was then, Living Social, called me up and said, "Hey, Glenn, uh, we've got this team that's kind of struggling and in trouble, and I think you can help. Would you take on this director position?" Um, I didn't expect to like it, and I kind of thought, okay, well, I'll do it to help out, and you can do anything for a year. And I was surprised by how much I liked it. Um, but I've told people, ask what the biggest mistake people make is. I think the biggest mistake is probably thinking that you are there to manage things.
Mm.
Um, uh, I've told a number of people, and it's not just a joke, it's true. I think a secret of my success was that for the first year of being an engineering director, I would every day get up and make coffee and get dressed and come sit at this desk and before I signed on, I'd kind of mentally say to myself, okay, I don't know how to do this job again today. Here goes. Um, and when you have that attitude, and it's true, and it'll always be true, because every week is a new situation, and
Yeah.
uh, it's always changing, and there's people situations, and there's technical situations, and business and market situations. You're winging it all the time, and when you have that attitude of, oh, okay, I don't know how to do this job, you have to rely on and trust the people who work for you and
Yeah.
around you. And uh, I did, and it paid off for me. Um, uh, People live up to the trust you have in them for the most
Yeah.
part.
Well, that sort of reminds me of the misattributed quote, or the proper quote, but we've it's gone through the chain of operator, right? And I know
Yeah,
I've used it enough that I owe you royalties, I'm sure. And that's the infamous bad developers will move heaven and earth to do the wrong thing, which I'm sure I got from Neil. So let's blame Neil for getting it
uh,
wrong, because you corrected us last month that it is actually slightly different in the original form. But much as we translate from the original Greek, and things get lost, clearly that happened with us.
yeah. That's something I said. You know, late one night in the hotel bar at an NFJS conference, in the company of Neil and like Venkat and a couple of other people. And I just dropped a link into chat. I eventually wrote a blog post about it so I could get the real quote in
Nice.
written form, citable form. Um, what you say is close. I don't ever like calling developers bad. I used the term weak.
Sure.
Um, but, um, you know, um, I started learning Ruby in 2000. I was a Java guy. I was a
Hmm.
Java bigot, to be quite honest. And, but pragmatic Dave Thomas started getting me interested in Ruby in 2000.
Yeah.
And it was another 6 years before I started using it full time professionally. I'd kind of sneak it into projects sideways in a supporting role. But there was this um, kind of conventional wisdom at the time that uh, some languages are just too powerful for regular developers. Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to give them a gun that big,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and stick with Java. It's safe and has rounded corners, and kind of a nerf language. And
I
um,
like that. A nerf language.
yeah, that's not original to me. I can't remember who said that, but um, uh, you something as powerful as Ruby or Common Lisp or
Yep.
whatever. You want to be careful who you give a tool that powerful to. And I believed that conventional wisdom for a long time. And then in 2004 and 5, I was in a role in a big company where I was part of an architecture team doing architecture reviews. And um, I and I don't want to be cruel when I say this. Design is hard,
Hmm.
and this company did not have the highest hiring standards, uh, and so I expected the designs to not be very good.
Sure.
This is why we were there, to help with this, and um, uh, these developers were doing the best they could and the best they knew how to do. Um, but some of the designs were really awful. But what amazed me was not that the designs were awful. What amazed me was that they had, through sheer force of will, because they had a job to do and wanted to accomplish something, they had wrestled these bad designs
Right.
across the finish line.
Right.
Whereas I would have, at some point gone, wait, hold on.
Time out.
Why is this so hard? We did something
Hmm.
wrong somewhere
Hmm.
along the lines, um, which is the beginning of wisdom, but they were just like, this is our design and we've got to make it work.
Right.
And that's where it came from. Weak developers will move heaven and earth to do the wrong thing because they think it's the right thing and they have a job to do and they want to get it
Right.
done.
Right.
And to tie us back to the whole Java and Ruby thing, what I realized was those designs and systems couldn't have been screwed up any worse if they had been done in a powerful language. And
Sure.
I was having a conversation about this revelation to a close friend of mine, and he said, well, yeah, I get that, but with Ruby, they'd screw up faster. And I just went, you're very close to an important realization.
Almost there.
Because what so often happens is the people who by the time the mistake, maybe it's not as much this way anymore. Cycle times have decreased a lot, and we tend everybody or most everybody develops iteratively and has short release cycles. But what used to happen back then was, by the time your design was actually deployed and you started learning all the horrors of it, you'd been moved to a different project.
Right.
And you didn't learn from that mistake. And
right.
Failing faster and having tighter feedback loops is really good for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Thindle in the comments says C makes it easy to shoot your foot off. C++ makes it harder, but when you do, you blow off your whole leg.
Yep.
So
that is a Jarn Strustrup quote.
Yep,
from the
exactly.
man himself. So yeah.
Well, the you bring up feedback loops, and I think that's a really important concept. And I'm sure I stole this from Neil as well. But there's always this question I get around architecture, like how long should you be an engineer before you're ready to be an architect? And what I've landed on is you need to have been on a project long enough to see the consequences of your decisions. And there's this adage, and this is just one of those, everybody's quoted it, but most developers don't have 10 years of experience. They have 1 year, 10 times.
Yeah,
and I've certainly seen that.
Henny quote.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where you need to know, oh, that was a really bad idea. I remember I architected this Java system a bazillion years ago, and I had the bright idea to have a separate interface and implementation for everything because it'll make it easier to swap these out for testing, blah, blah, blah.
If it's a good idea in some places, it should be a good idea in all
everywhere.
Places, right?
Just do it everywhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good idea, and I just had a whole thing of impls and interfaces, and we only ever had one impl, and it's like, why do we have this extra interface? Because I made a bad decision, and I said that too. I'm like, yep, I screwed that one up, but it was too late to fix it, so we're here. That's where it is.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. You need to have been on a project long enough to learn the both positive and negative consequences of your decisions. But I would then go farther and say that as an architect, once you are in an architecture role, you need to make sure you stay associated with projects long enough to keep feeling and learning the consequences of your decisions, or else that's not doing that is how you get ivory tower architects that design unworkable systems because they're no longer experiencing that feedback loop.
Yeah, and I think that's why enterprise architecture typically gets such a bad rap, because it can be so astronaut-y, and it's unless it's pulling things up and truly seeing across the org, we have these same issues, let's solve it one way instead of 5 ways. But in practice,
and the secret there is to bring in the people that are closer to the trenches on those individual things. The really key value of the enterprise architect is to identify the opportunity and bring the right people together to find the right solution, not to dictate that solution or design it in isolation.
And that's hard because that takes some humility to know that I'm actually not the best person to dictate a solution. I should be getting this input from the folks who are boots on the ground, and then, all right, folks, what's going to work for you? And then I'll go figure out how to get that through procurement or whatever. And but that's why that's a hard role to fill. Let's see. Well, I thought the trick was, Thindle says the trick was to move on before the whole thing falls down in an organized heap. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, there is some truth to that, right?
There's a time to cut your losses.
Absolutely. Not that I'm suggesting anyone leave a burning heap behind them. Sometimes that is the only option for your sanity is I just have to move on and try something
Hmm.
different. But
Yep.
yeah, I've never had the desire to be in sort of the people management role, and I applaud folks like you who are willing to do that and have the chops and still have the technical chops because I just don't love the idea of I remember one of my early managers said it's sort of like adult daycare.
In some ways, but uh, I would say, and maybe I've just been really blessed to have uh, good people under me that don't make it feel that way.
Sure.
Um, and part of that too, I think, I leaped completely over frontline management.
Sure.
I went from being a tech lead on a team of 4 people, maybe 5, to being director over a team of 40, with everybody who reported me also being a manager.
Sure.
Um, Frontline management may have a little bit more of that element to it,
Sure.
but uh, you know, I got lucky,
Yeah.
and never had to deal with that. And
Yeah.
I there's probably some lessons I could have learned uh, from that would serve me well today that I didn't get to learn, but kind of glad I didn't. I was able to jump over that.
It's amazing to me how a bad hire in that frontline management role can be so destructive. I mean, I've seen teams just get obliterated with a bad manager or a good manager who, let's just say, has some indiscretions. I was on a team that imploded because the manager did something he shouldn't have, and it had some pretty serious ramifications. And I think that's another one of those things that gets lost a lot is that those decisions are important, and getting the right people in the right spot matters a lot to the team cohesion. And
I'm going to avoid mentioning names or companies or explicit time frames here, but I built a team that I was incredibly proud of. Such a fantastic, high functioning team. Um, and uh, then I moved on into a different role, and that team was put under a different leader. And um, I had a conversation with them, and I said, "This is a very high functioning team. They don't need to be managed. Uh, they uh, they your best bet is to mostly leave them alone
right.
and encourage them." And in 3 months, he came that close to completely destroying the team,
Oh,
and I was able to uh, play politics
yeah,
basically, and make the right people aware of the situation and get them moved.
sure, sure.
Uh, it was a horrible thing to watch happening.
Yeah, yeah. I've. Oh, here's an interesting one. Thindle says, I was involved in a project. We literally had a person on payroll whose job was to keep the other bosses from coming in and micromanaging and bypassing the PM. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that's worth something right there. Just,
it is.
you guard the door, give them
Right.
what they need, give them the cover sheets for the TPS reports, and we'll just keep turning out the right stuff. So
Yeah.
let me poke at languages a little bit because this is I very distinctly remember sitting in a session of yours on JavaScript, and I desperately wanted to see session 2, but my wife had had enough and she wanted to leave, and so I had to leave before I could see part 2. But you definitely have a history with different languages, and I'm curious what drew you towards Ruby in particular, and because I mean I had the same pull at similar times, and I know I was also very influenced by Prag Dave, but I'd love to get your thoughts on what was it about Ruby, as I was also a big Java fan, that made you, wow, this is a pretty cool language and I want to play around with it.
um yeah, I've always been a language buff. I've always been interested in in that. I've always seen it as these are ways of expressing what we know about a problem and a solution, and there are good ways and better ways and maybe not so good ways to express those things, and I want to
Right.
find good ways. um, I mentioned earlier that the first language I learned was basic, and um, I wasn't told it was basic. I was told it was, here's how you program this computer.
Right.
And when I found out there were other programming languages, I had no idea what they even could possibly look like.
Right.
uh, how could there be a different way? And um, so then when I learned other things, I was really fascinated by that. Ruby in particular. So I mentioned that I was a Java guy, a very strongly opinionated Java guy. I was one of the first, I think, about 25 or 30 people outside of Sun Microsystems to ever write a Ruby Java program. Um, I got a copy of, at that time it was called Oak
Yes.
0.94 beta from James Gosling after talking to him at a conference in January of 95. And so I was really, really into that and very early
Yeah.
adopter. Um, uh, but I found, and then when I first encountered Java, it was like, oh, like my ambitions were here, but the languages was using kind of made it
Right.
harder to go above here, and Java's going to let me get there. This is great. But after 4.5 or 5 years, my ambitions had
Yes.
increased, and
Yes.
Java was able to keep up to a certain point, but I started
Yeah, there's still
bumping
a
up
gap.
against
There's a gap.
the limitations of Java. And plus, I was a little bit bored and just itching to learn something new. And I
Sure.
told the people I worked with, this would have been about 2000. I told the people I worked with that I was getting bored of Java and wanted to learn something new. And must have been 8 or 9 people said, you should learn C sharp.
Huh.
And I was, to this day, I'm flabbergasted by that answer, uh, because that is purely a lateral move. I mean,
Yes.
it it would open up another part of the market for me to work in,
Right. Right.
but I wasn't hurting for that.
Hmm.
It wasn't like job opportunities for Java people were scarce. uh, I wanted to expand my brain and my
Right.
capabilities. And I played with um, Haskell and a couple of other things. And but ultimately bought the first edition of the Pickaxe book and started playing with Ruby. And it did exactly what I wanted to do. It expanded my brain and how I thought
Yes.
about problems. And in fact, um, it nearly always felt like the hard part about learning Ruby was unlearning things
Hmm.
from Java, not learning new things about Ruby, unlearning things that C and C++ and Java had
Yeah.
taught me were the
The
way
one
things
way.
had to be done.
Hmm.
But oh, what do you know? In Ruby, that's not built into the language at all. It's something you can write yourself with a method.
Right.
I always thought it had to be a built-in language construct, and that kind of thing happened over and over. And um, uh, that feeling of kind of knocking apart your frame of reference with a sledgehammer and having to rebuild it again in a way that'll accommodate different ideas is undeniably challenging and uncomfortable at first.
Right.
But when your new frame of reference starts coming together and you see things in a different way, it's really exhilarating.
Yeah.
Um, and that carried me for a number of years, continuing to learn more about what you could do with a more dynamic language like Ruby, and becoming an expert developer in it.
Yeah. I actually created a whole graduate school class around a lot of those ideas, sort of exploring dynamic languages, kind of right as Rails was sort of on the scene, and
Hmm.
that was the focus of our attention for probably the first 3 or 4 years I taught it. And then I realized actually the interesting bit here is technology change ultimately, and so the class kind of morphed. But
Right.
to your point, learning something that is so different from what you do day in, day out will change the way you do that thing you use day in, day out. And I think that's one of those
Yes.
aspects people forget, that you might not write Ruby on your day job, but it's going to change the
Mhm.
way you write your Java or your C sharp or whatever it is you're doing day in, day out.
After I started learning Ruby, I continued to write Java mostly on the job for another 5 years. Um, but Ruby changed how I wrote Java. And I was always very careful not to like, I wasn't trying to reinvent Ruby in Java. I wasn't trying
Right.
to, it wasn't like I was trying to wedge something in there that didn't fit, but it opened my mind to new ways of thinking about problems. Um, and lo and behold, once you can think about problems that way, the tools are there in Java and you
Mm-hmm.
can do that. And it changed the way I wrote Java programs.
And I do think that's one of the most amazing aspects to me about the Java ecosystem is how well it has evolved, especially over the last, I'd say, 10-ish years. I mean, there
Hmm.
was some time in the desert there, to be
Oh
blunt,
yeah, for sure.
but I feel like we've come through that, and we're on the other side. So thank goodness for some very good leadership there. But yeah, to your point, it shows you some other options. We get so stuck
Hmm.
in, as you said, sort of the one true way to solve it because that's how we've always done it before. And
Right.
yeah, but you could do it this way too. It's like, oh, I didn't even know that was an option. Yeah, it is.
Hmm.
You could try that. So,
And it might not be uh, strictly better in all circumstances to do it this way, but it is in some.
yeah, yeah,
And having that tool in your mental toolbox is really useful.
yes. Yeah, so Thindle says, wasn't ZX Basic the one true God? And that makes me. I have this sort of theory that for a lot of developers, time begins with the first language they learned,
Hmm.
and nothing preceded that. And we don't do a particularly good job of talking about our history. And you alluded to it, that well, Java is a C language, and so it comes from that history, and it has certain design decisions and certain approaches that aren't there in languages that descend from,
Right.
say, Lisp or something to that effect. And
Yep.
and understanding some of those trees can be really beneficial to changing the way you look at some of these problems.
I got interested in the history of computer science pretty early, history of programming languages in particular, but not just that. And uh, probably around the time that you sat in on that JavaScript talk I used to do, I also did a talk called "Everything Old is New Again," um, and it was during a period when a lot of people were starting to rediscover ideas from the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
and in some cases 50s,
Mm.
and realized that there was some gold to be mined there. But yes, you're right. In general, we don't have a good track record of understanding our history in our field.
Why does Java need these newfangled lambdas? Still one of my all-time favorite questions.
Yeah,
Why does
case
Java
in
need these
point.
newfangled lambdas? Uh-huh. Yep,
You,
exactly.
you mean those
What
things that were in arguably the oldest higher level language in existence? Sure.
So Java Grunt wonders if they'd be better if they had learned COBOL before BASIC. I don't know that I'd go that far. Although to be fair, I think you can make a really good living as a COBOL programmer. And
You still can.
yeah,
Um, but going back to a comment I made earlier, I don't think that's a particularly effective way of expressing our
oh,
understanding of
oh.
of of problems and solutions, except for particularly narrow subset of problems.
But see, then we won't need programmers because the business people just write the code.
Uh-huh.
It
Yeah.
amazes me that we keep trying that,
Tell me another one.
right?
It really amazes me. At that, I mentioned earlier a job where I was on an architecture board and doing architectural reviews, and it was for a very old school IT group that um, still had some COBOL and some RPG and things like that. And a vendor, I can't even remember. I wouldn't say it if I remembered, but
Yeah.
I have no recollection of the name because I just pretty immediately flushed them out of my memory. All I remember was they came in and um, were talking about not having to rely on code and um, not being dependent on these object programmers.
Nice. Nice.
And, you know, we were just sitting there and we let him go for about 10 minutes. And it was like, everybody in this room is a programmer, not just an architect.
Right.
And we are those object programmers. And they basically just packed up and left because,
Right.
they had blown their whole opportunity.
Read the room.
Yeah. Yes.
I've seen that too. I had a similar experience. I don't remember what the tool was or the vendor. I wouldn't mention it even if I did. And that was the way they kicked off their training.
Mhm.
Said to a room full of programmers, and the best thing about our product is you don't need any programmers. It's like, really? Is that really? I don't think. Try again. Try again. I mean, that might make for a good marketing pitch to
Like,
the C-suite, but
every part of that sentence is wrong.
yeah,
It's not actually true, and even if it were true, it wouldn't be the best thing about your product.
yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and I think again that's part of the history, the fact we don't learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think of Brooks. I was on a project once where a project manager literally said, "I'm going to try to prove Brooks wrong." And I'm flabbergasted at frankly the arrogance of
Oh
something
yeah,
like that. He was right when he wrote it. What now? That's probably almost 40 years ago,
yeah.
and he's going to be right in 40 years.
That
It's
was Mythical Man Month was early '70s, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, I know I
Yeah.
read. Oh, and there's my kitty cat getting positioned on the shelf behind me as his wont is. Apparently, he got kicked out of his chair, so he'll be miffed about that. Well, I mean, it was his chair while you were gone, Christine. So it works out. Works out. So, is it even a Zoom call if you didn't have an animal in it? I don't think so.
Well, and my rule is that animals that appear on screen in distributed meetings must be introduced.
Well, this is Han. This is one of my two cats. He has some very strong opinions about how the day is supposed to go. So, like usually
Mm,
when I eat breakfast, he's supposed to be sitting on my lap when that happens, and if that doesn't happen, he gets upset. And if you need to get up and he's not done with his snuggling, he'll give you
yes,
kind
that's
of
a
a whiny
common
little
thing.
yeah. He's like, I'm not ready. Why are you moving, human? So yeah, we're just heating pads for the cats, I think, is our job, which is fine. We all have a role to play,
Sure. Yeah.
you know.
Exactly.
My favorite cat quote I ever saw, and this was at like a pet grooming place or something, was dogs have owners, cats have staff.
Hmm.
So yep, that's one of my. The other one, I don't know where the other one is. He usually ignores these calls and it's really whiny, but he's more of an afternoon cat. I think is his thing.
Oh,
This is
okay.
the
Yeah,
morning
I get it.
cat. He's the afternoon cat. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, Brooks has been around a long time, and it does amaze me how people either are unfamiliar with it or somehow think that there are silver bullets and that if you do put more people on the project, it'll go faster. And we just make the same mistakes again and again and again, and I don't get it.
Yeah. Oh, and the silver bullet uh, thing. Um, he in the second edition of Mythical Man Month, he included the No Silver Bullet essay and a follow up on No Silver Bullet Revisited, and it was mostly a history of people saying yes, there is a silver bullet, and here it is, and how it turned out not to be, and but one thing about it is his claim was that there is no silver bullet for software development was very carefully constructed.
Hmm.
Here's what I mean by a silver bullet, and here's what I'm comparing it to in the hardware world, and things like that. And the if you understand the argument, I think it's incontrovertible.
Right.
And not just that there hasn't been one, but there couldn't in principle be one.
Hmm.
Um, and I haven't seen anything to change my mind on that.
Right. So talking about languages and history, I do have an interesting question. Well, I think it's interesting. It's interesting to me. Do you have any sort of criteria or guidelines that you use when a new language comes around or a new technology that you use to say whether or not it's worth your time, attention, whether you want to dive into it? Is there anything that you sort of heuristics that you apply formally, informally to kind of sift through that? Because I think it's one of our challenges. Is
That's not an
you know,
interesting question.
sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Uh, a lot of it is, um, you know, uh, as a business person, uh, maybe I should be a little more utilitarian and pragmatic about these things. Um, I I want to know that it either solves a problem in a better way or provides a better way of thinking. There's another old quote. I love quotes. I think this is Perlis. A language that doesn't teach you a new way of thinking about a problem isn't worth learning, or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and so, just a different syntax or a different gloss on the same way of thinking doesn't necessarily attract me. Um, I am uh, swayed quite often by uh, the quality of people who are interested in it.
Yes.
If people I respect are interested in it, of course, there one relatively recent misfire in that respect. I still don't know why so many people I like and respect like Go so much.
Mm.
Um, uh, but um, things I'm interested in now. Um, I've been brought back into the closure world with a recent job change. Um, I had been pulled away from it for pragmatic reasons, but I do love closure and uh, what it does and what it makes possible. Um, Elixir, as much for the underlying Erlang technology as for the language, although the language
Sure.
is nice as well. Um, the Beam makes it easy to build systems with certain characteristics that are just very difficult to achieve on other platforms. And also Rust, because it's the first answer I've seen to how do we have a language that allows us to solve what I'll call systems problems,
Hmm.
building operating systems or low-level utilities or things like that that have high performance and quick startup and good predictability and things like that, but also allow you to express it using pretty high level abstractions.
Right.
Um, for a long time, it was like you could either build high level abstractions and have poorer performance in general, or a long startup time in Java's case, or garbage collector pauses, or all those things, or you could have the kind of performance profile that you want from a systems language, but be restricted to kind of low level abstractions. And Rust merges those pretty nicely.
Java Grunt asks, can we fully measure a language's value based only on the language, or do we need to also consider where, how, when the language gets used as part of that?
You absolutely need to consider those things, and also the community around the language.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
That's a great point.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I look at the community, frankly, as one of the most important aspects of whether this is worth my time, just in terms of who's in it and is it vibrant? I think
Hmm.
we tend to overemphasize size, and that's not as important as is the community vibrant.
Yeah. And um, in particular, I think at a certain point the size becomes almost a negative. Um,
Mm,
I uh, for most of my career, I have lived in niche languages that are not the most popular thing. And I kind of think that's the place to be. Maybe not if you're building a training business or something like that,
sure,
where the
sure.
size of the market is um, a really big part of your business model. But um, I kind of want to be in off the beaten path.
Right, right. So Thindle says they like Perl because it has built-in obfuscation. All right, I could see that. I could see that. And Thindle,
Yeah.
the name of the cat is Han, and his brother's name is Chewy because we have a
Okay.
history of naming our cats. Our last two cats were Benny and June after the movie, and apparently
Uh-huh.
it's bath time for Han. So I'm going to try to block him a little bit in case he decides to, do something else here.
The nether regions.
Yeah, that's the beauty of being a cat, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's see. I spent multiple weeks in the COBOL community. 1 out of 10 did not like. Yeah, Java Grunt. I will grudgingly admit I have written COBOL. It didn't last long, and I very quickly moved on to a Java project once I realized I had other options. And
I have never written a
um,
Java program or a COBOL program. I did in 94 or 95 or something like that. My wife was working in a job where she was a COBOL programmer.
okay.
And on a couple of occasions, she came and woke me up to help her at 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning while she was trying to debug something that had gone wrong in a batch job, and she was on call, and I sat peering over her shoulder trying to help her figure out what was going on, but that's as close as I ever
Nice.
came to it.
I went through like I guess you call it an onboarding kind of thing for all the new hires, and part of that was learning COBOL, even if you weren't going to necessarily work on COBOL for the
Hmm.
company. And I remember asking the trainer, I don't remember what phrase this was. I said, "Is that pass by value or pass by reference?" And he just sort of stopped. He had this big smile on his face, and I realized as I looked around that most of the other people in the room had no idea what I just
Oh no.
asked, and he just
Yeah.
laughed, and he knew it. He knew the answer, and
Yeah.
and you could tell he was like, "All right, no one's ever asked me that here before. Thank you for that." So it's Thindle says they know someone who is porting COBOL to a modern database in .NET. Yeah, I mean there's
Oh
still
yeah.
plenty of that going around, and literally says the C# solution is worse. I doubt that's C#'s fault, if I had to
uh
wager.
well, might be just the fault of the mismatch
Yeah, could
between
be.
models. um
Yeah,
uh I will say, COBOL is an easy punching bag, but for the problems it was created for in the time, this goes to
yes,
the previous comment
yes,
about you can't just judge the language. In the time and place, and for the businesses and the problems it was created for, it was an admirable engineering solution to a tough problem, and its longevity speaks to that.
yeah,
I don't want to be involved in it because those aren't the kinds of programs I write, and that's
right.
not the part of the industry I'm in. But if I were, COBOL would be a fine solution to that.
Mm-hmm. Java Grunt suggests the build packs will make everything easier, even COBOL. So, it's probably true. And VB6 to the rescue, Code with Sean says. Sure, VB6 solves lots of problems. Yeah,
Yeah,
I avoided that one, thankfully. But
I have never written a program that will only run on a PC.
that's
I I,
remarkable.
I have never written a program. Well, a couple of batch files,
Okay,
right?
okay.
But I've never written any program that will only run on a Microsoft operating system.
VB6, all the things, Code with Sean says. So there we go. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think part of what I've learned from being around you and sort of steeping in that sort of culture is knowing the importance of learning other languages and not being so fixated on this is my hammer and it solves every problem. And I think that's an important trait. But
Well, uh, you know, name dropping a couple other of our friends here. It's what Neil Ford and Mark Richards talk about in their architecture book in their class about
mhm,
technical depth and technical breadth, right? Um, there, you need to know what you don't know, and you need to know a little bit about enough things that you know when it's time to go learn them,
right,
right? And so I've always, through my whole career, tried to spend uh, 90% of my time getting better at the tools I've chosen, but leaving time for uh, learning about what else is out there and getting just enough depth in those things to go to be able to notice, oh,
Yeah.
this is the time when I need to go learn that technology in depth or and pull it in, or at least take a more serious gander at it. If you don't know what you don't know, you're kind of stuck where you are.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. Java calls that T-shaped. That's certainly
Yeah,
something
yeah,
I've
yeah.
talked
The
a lot
T-shaped
about.
person.
Yeah, trying to be more T-shaped there. Thindle says the only bad thing about COBOL is that it's stuck. A ton of
Yeah.
businesses think it works. Something new might not. Let's keep it. And a lot's built on it. And that's a great point. We have
Yep.
so much that's running. And I've thought about this before too. You know what I mean? How many billions of dollars is running through COBOL system as we sit
Uh,
here and talk
it's
right now?
astonishing.
And what's our argument for rewriting it exactly? Is COBOL like is it no longer supported? No, nobody's writing COBOL. I mean, it at this point the biggest challenge is finding people who will write it. But
Right.
you know, if you throw enough money at that problem, it'll go away. Maybe.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and then oh yeah, your Java programmer that runs in a lot of places. Very true. Sean admits he did leave VB6 behind 2 decades ago. Glad he did. I'm with you there. Digitalization in the 70s, COBOL was the best option. It did not do what it was designed for very well. Wanted to be the VBA of the 70s. Yeah, I'll hear that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Java Grunt says the 90-10 approach to learning, yeah, matches the T-shaped approach. I agree with
Hmm.
that. And then, yes, the problem with COBOL is that those programmers are not just retiring, they are leaving this mortal coil.
Yeah.
And oh, IBM's now doing free COBOL courses. Wow. Yeah, I mean, that it's I think it was a victim of its success, if you want to put it that way. I mean, think about some of the earliest adopters of technology,
Hmm.
and they're the ones who are now suffering the most with that technical debt. And I know that was something you and I talked about in the pre-show. How do we deal with technical debt? What kind of guidance do you have on folks to deal with that?
I brought this up in the pre-show because for the third or fourth time in the past 6 months, I had somebody recently ask me, like, how do you deal with that? Uh, and at a couple of previous jobs, and I'm surprised when I get that question because um, I've seen it done really well, and um, so I'll illustrate at I'm talking about um, uh, where I worked from 2016 through 2019 or 2020, a little company called First, little real estate tech company based in Durham, North Carolina. Um, I was the VP of engineering there, so I could sort of define with the product VP how this was all done. And so basically, for little things, developers were uh, always understood that they had the power and the leeway to make the system better than they found it, um,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of using the old extreme programming idea of you need to add this new functionality to the system. Okay, is the system designed to easily accommodate that? If
Right.
so, I just add it. If not, well, I take off my add new functionality hat and I put on my refactor hat and I redesign the system until it can easily accommodate the new
Mm.
functionality. And then I switch hats again and I put it back in. All the programmers knew that they had the leeway to do that within reason, right?
Sure.
So within reason means if you if we kind of thought this felt like a 1 day task, and well, it doing it that way and cleaning up the technical debt or not leaving technical debt behind would take a day and a half or maybe even 2 days. Okay, I'll just do that, because we all know that tasks
Right.
grow by that much. But if it's going to be longer, okay, bring it up. And then the for larger things, what we did was those became stories.
Sure.
Those became stories, and we tried to have 10% of every sprint on average be engineering driven stories aimed at cleaning up technical debt. Some sprints we didn't get to do that. Something was a high
Sure.
priority, and we had to. Other sprints we had 20%.
Sure.
And this was a back and forth and a dialogue between engineering and product people. Um, but what I tried to get across to the engineers was, uh, left to their own devices, the product managers will never leave you time in the sprint to do technical
Right.
debt cleanup. They
Right.
won't, and it's not because they're evil, and it's not because they're selfish. It's because they just don't know. They don't
Yeah.
they don't have any way to know the capacity of the team
Mm-hmm.
except for the engineering team telling them. And so, uh, I've seen a lot of places reach this agreement that we will, uh, leave time for uh, technical debt work, but it never happens. Why don't they
Right.
ever leave us the time? And well, it's because the engineers. This is painting with a really broad brush, but in my experience, it's because the engineers don't, as a team, put their foot down and say, "This is all we can handle this sprint, so that we can have time to do this thing that we need to do." Um, One final thing on this point. Um, Quite often, well, precisely because product manager people outside the code base, people who don't live in the code base every day, aren't going to understand the need for this technical debt cleanup or the details of it or how it's going to be done, and that makes them worry about it.
Right.
So it's worth planning it out. Here's how we're going to do it. Here are the steps. And at every step, we'll have a working system.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you lay that out, and it gives them comfort. And it says, oh, they're not just going to uh, go off and get lost in a maze of twisty tunnels. They have a defined plan for how they're going to solve this problem, and if necessary, we can break it up into multiple cards and schedule one part this sprint and one the next sprint, and um, you know, take it seriously like feature work,
Yeah.
and plan it and map it out and provide a defined detailed way of how you're going to get to it, and that tends to make all kinds of objections go away.
Well, and then also help those folks understand why this work is important and
Yeah,
how this is going to benefit them. It isn't just,
right.
just trust me. We're just going to do some stuff. You're not even going to
Yeah,
notice. Like, we need to be able to have those conversations too, and take the effort to help them understand why this is in their best interest.
yeah. There's a talk I did at RailsConf, I think, in 2019, called the 30-month migration, uh, about how, as a team, over a period of 2.5 years, we gradually refactored the core part of the data model of a production system, in little steps, uh, as we could find the time. And every step of the way, we applied those lessons that I'm talking about here.
Vendel said, "I thought we were back to the strategy of just getting out of there before everything collapses. Don't do that. Do it properly the first time." Let's see. XP hasn't heard XP in a while. Java Grunt likes the
You
within
should.
reason. Yeah.
We should
Yeah.
rediscover that.
Well, I think, because I remember when XP came on the scene, and I feel like a little bit of that was a messaging problem. That
Sure. Oh
if I
yeah.
said extreme to a director, VP, business type person, whoa, 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 I want you to do nothing extreme with my system here, guy. I'm already,
Yeah.
not so happy with you programmers, and now you want to be extreme.
And additionally, some of the early messaging was extremely, quite prescriptive. You have to do it this way. If you're not
Yeah.
doing all 12 of these practices, you're not doing it right. Um, and the fact of the matter is, um, some teams can't do all those things.
Mhm.
However, 8/10 of the time, probably, when somebody says, "Oh, we could never do that," they actually could. and
Mm,
and so that prescriptive messaging was trying to get past the initial biases and casual, oh, they won't let us do that. Well, what if you tell them you have to?
right.
uh,
Right.
and so it's but there's a lot of wisdom there, and a lot of um, mostly the way we talk about software process today stops at the day-to-day stuff. But the day-to-day stuff matters. It's not
Right.
just about sprints and planning poker and things like that. The way you do things every day makes a big difference.
Yeah. So Thindle basically has used, I guess you'd call it sort of like a tech debt kind of sprint. So let's just do bugs and debt fixing, things of that nature. And Java Grunt agrees it was a messaging problem. And then Thindle says, we talking about XP, we talking about Scrum. I mean, we could probably spend an hour bashing on Scrum if we wanted to, but I think that's some
Yeah,
well trodden soil, as they
it
say. And
is.
the extreme feedback light that told the entire office if things were broken or not working. Yeah, I agree, Java Grunt. I think having those very visible, monitors that said,
Hmm.
"Hey, there's something going wrong. What do you mean? Let's all hands on deck trying to fix that." A little
Information
harder. Yes,
radiators.
the information raters. A little harder now that we're mostly remote, which that was one of the things I wanted to get to, but we're damn near out of time. So, let me pick at one other thing here. So, you gave your engineers the freedom to make the code better than when you found it.
Hmm.
I will never forget having this younger developer talk to me one day and he said, Nate, I'm going into the code. I'm trying to do it the right way. I get a bug, I write some tests, I clean up the code. But then my manager has a one-on-one with me and says, gee, why does it take you 2 days to do this when I give it to the senior guy, it takes 2 hours? Completely missing the fact that the senior guy is actually causing more problems than he's fixing, and he's just slapping stuff together and throwing it out there and hoping it works. This person got so frustrated they eventually left the company, and I remember thinking like, geez, how do I fix the problem that the manager really steps in and says, no, no, don't do it the right way, do it the fast way.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I don't. Again, I was privileged to be the manager in this case. I
Right.
was the VP of engineering. I could define this. I don't have a good answer to that question, um, but uh, here's a hint. Um, Velocity is a really loaded, troublesome word. It's it's impossible to really measure developer productivity or feature speed or anything in any precise way or any meaningful way. And anytime you try to get precise with it, it's so easy to game.
Mm,
But in my experience, in spite of that, everybody knows when it's getting slower.
right.
Everybody, they can't boil it down to numbers, and if they do, there's things you can argue about, but everybody knows, man, it used to be we could accomplish this in a week, and now it takes a month or more to do the same complexity of thing. And everybody knows that. So you can have a conversation about why. And some of it's inherent. As a system
Mm,
grows and becomes more complex, new features are going to fight old features.
yeah.
Uh, and you have to be careful as you're adding value not to destroy the value that's already there. So some of it's inherent, but you can talk about uh, it took me this long because this part of the code is a mess and it was entangled over here and I tried this but it doesn't work because it interfered with X, Y, and Z. And even non-technical people can understand that if you take the time to think hard about how to convey that and explain it.
Mm,
And if people are worried about decline in velocity, which everybody is on every team, um, uh, it opens the door for you to start talking about the causes. And
mm,
those causes, it's frustrating. The causes are going to be things that the people who aren't programmers can't see,
right.
but um, but they can understand
Yeah.
if we take the time to explain it to them.
Yeah. Well, and that happens in other spaces too. I mean, take your car and you
Sure.
get fixed and like, oh yeah, this is an easy fix. And oh, actually, once we got this apart, we realized this needed to be fixed too. And then we got to take this apart, and people don't sort of flip tables over that. And,
Right.
we don't know sometimes until we get in there, but
They
maybe
don't
we need to
necessarily
do.
trust it, but uh, building trust on your team
Mhm.
is the work of weeks and months and years.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, if they're not receptive right now, keep doing good work best you
right.
can.
Build that
Being
credibility.
being honest, have integrity, gradually build that trust, and maybe they'll listen to you in 6 months.
Well, I know we got to wrap up here, but Thindle wants to know if you're working for the Brazilian bank.
I am working for the Brazilian bank. Years ago, I worked for Relevance, which eventually became Cognitect, that is the custodian of Clojure and the creator of Datomic. And the largest Datomic customer, Nubank, bought them in late 2019. And my old friend Justin Gedlin called me up shortly after that and said, you should come join us again. So I'm working for Nubank in Brazil remotely. Um, it's the most fun job I've ever had. It's a great company. I'm proud to be here and
That's
proud of what
awesome.
we're doing here.
That's awesome. Well, I can't believe I didn't even get a chance to mention Ted Lasso, other than to say if you haven't watched the Ted Lasso holiday mustache special,
I have
you
done,
should. It's
yes.
funny, and I'm desperately waiting for season three. But that'll have to be a story for our next show. So
Yes.
I think I'll have to have Beth reach out. We'll get you on again here sometime in the new year here, and as we get kicked off. So I'm so happy you were my first guest of 2022, and man, isn't that crazy to say
It was fun.
2022? So I
Yeah.
appreciate your time and we will be back next week with actually a neighbor, so to speak, of mine, Heidi here in the Twin Cities from Launch Darkly. Will be hanging out with me, so we'll get
Okay.
sure we'll get into some fun stuff. But
Yeah, that'd
till
be
then,
cool.
Glenn, thank you so much for hanging out with me, buddy. I really appreciate it. You have a great day, my man.
Thanks, Nate. Bye.